My name is William Ayotte. I'm based in the UK. I live in Wales. I'm a poet, an author, a coach, and a ritualist. And I teach at INSEAD. I'm very interested in how we can marry different kinds of thinking and talking today. So I'm really looking forward to this morning. Thank you. And it's morning where I am.
Donna Ivy. I am in the Gold Coast, a beautiful sunny northern Australia in the tropics. And my specialty or my passion is education and learning for people. And my hope for today is to gain inspiration from everybody who is in this convening and their perspectives, their wisdom, to particularly from a personal perspective, to assist me in my journey in trying to engage humans back into work and learning, which is my passion. I'd also like to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. This is absolute, I'm so stoked to be involved in this. It has been a wonderful lead up. I've loved it. I've loved the base camp and I just think the whole thing is so inspiring, future thinking, brave, and I'm just so touched to be involved. And this is a real highlight for me. So thank you very much for the invitation to participate.
So I'm Stein. I'm the boring economist around the table. I work at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and more specifically, I work in the Employment, Labor and Social Affairs Directorate of the OECD. So really, I'm a labor market economist. And for the last 3 years, I've been working on the future of work, what kind of mega trends are happening and what impact they're having on the labor market. And at the moment, I'm particularly focused on artificial intelligence and its impact on the labor market, and also looking a little bit at the gig economy, new forms of work, and working conditions and regulations around that. And I have never been invited to such a diverse group, so I'm really curious to listen and hear what others have to say on the future of work. So I really look forward to this. Nice meeting you all.
Hi everyone, I'm Marcus. I'm based in Mumbai in India, hot and humid over here. And it's incredible to be with you all. I am at my core a biologist, scientist, medical doctor. I'm a science geek. I love the human body and brain. And in the 20+ years that I've been working, that has allowed me to do some very interesting things wearing different hats. I'm an author, I'm a founder, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a father, and I continue to do many different things. And I'm here because I'm always attracted to this idea of sharing wisdom, and the whole idea of even convening a set of people to weave wisdom together is a very attractive proposition. I think it's something the world needs a lot more of. It's certainly something we've all learned on reflection through 2020, and fascinated by the subject and hope to contribute in a positive way. This word work has been something which I've been thinking about for many years actually, and the whole definition of it, which everyone's familiar with, to extend beyond just the classical definition of jobs and moving beyond a job-based economy to be a work-based economy, and therefore what the role of purpose and meaning is integrated in that function for people. I find it very interesting for a couple of reasons. One is a few years ago, I was gifted this book, which is also on the shelf behind me, which is Viktor Frankl's book on man's search for meaning. And initially, the person who gifted it to me was doing so from the lens of sort of a psychiatrist, or that clinical medical side of things. But I became much more fascinated in what he was inferring around willpower and purpose, and creating purpose even in a situation as dire as suffering. Now, I think this is very important. So the sphere that I operate in, which is Asia, it's a very young continent, right? Even in India right now, we've got around 1 million people entering the workforce every month, 18-year-olds entering the workforce every month. And that's going to continue for many decades to come. And so it's often a position of conflict within organizations, because on one side, we have the old guard, people who've been there for many, many years. And then on the other side, you've got this generation, which has been spoken about as the purpose generation, the Gen Zs and the millennials that are coming in. And so as we think about how we can work with these organizations, is typically have 4 generations of people in there. The philosophy around what work means, what their objectives are in terms of purpose and meaning, and what they're trying to do in terms of building their career and their day-to-day activity, is very important for us to get right, because this is going to be a problem that needs to be solved for a very long period of time as we try and grow and reach standards which other parts of the world are more used to. As I layer on this thought, the other part of my work, which looks at human longevity, and I often joke around with people. In fact, I'm even giving a talk tomorrow at Google on why I intend to live to 120 and intend to have fun along the way. So if we're looking at the realistic situation in the next few decades, where life expectancies continue to increase and we see people living to become centenarians and longer, then that is obviously going to mean that the age of retirement, if people even retire at all, is going to be extrapolated even further out. And so we're going to have to solve these problems, not only from a health perspective, but from a sort of engagement perspective and from a economical perspective, etc. So this is why I find this topic so fascinating. And I'll end by just adding one other data point here, which was the Stanford study on longevity, which was conducted many years ago, where they looked at the biggest driver towards a person's enhanced lifespan and therefore their well-being and happiness coefficient in life. They're not just come from their physical health or what they spent their time doing, but it came from a sense of purpose, a lot of which had relationships, societal relationships around giving and community as well. And so whilst we try and decode the human genome and build bionic organ parts and all the other incredible CRISPR-Cas9 things that we're doing, this piece around creating purpose, around creating meaning in our lives is going to be as important, if not more, in ensuring that we have a healthy, fulfilled, happy, and long lifespan and health span for all of us.
I think just with what Marcus is saying there is that no individual, group, country, industry vertical experiences a future of work in the same way. There is no one future of work. So there is, and I think the conversation also needs to be about what the future of work means, because I think if we had this conversation 2 years ago, as we would know, it would be different. But there's been a big reset. There's been a pushing forward of some change that has been forecast for a very long time. And that's caused disruption and caused some of what was predicted and forecast to happen. And just as an example, hybridized workforces. So you've got people that are no longer confined to a place. So you're actually managing people, work, organizing work around in different times and spaces. So I think that this has thrown quite a unique and interesting situation for us to have a conversation about, but largely past traditions are no longer appropriate for the times that we are experiencing. But for me, I'm very interested in so many things. I don't have enough time in the day because I'm just there's so much stuff out there that interests me. But what I found interesting over the last 150 years, if we start with industrialization as a point of reset between agrarian kind of our world and industrialization, is that while so many things have changed, I think capitalism has driven a new modernity. We've got individualism. We have this feeling as consumers that we have a lot of choice, everything's customized. I don't think a great deal has changed with work. I don't think work has offered the promise that our society generally has offered us in terms of choice, in terms of being able to be self-determined in our identity. And I certainly do not believe that work has offered a place for us to feel a sense of belonging. I don't think it has any of the characteristics of community. And I think that purpose is hard won for so many people in work. So actually, I'm kind of happy that there's been this disruption, because I think we needed it. I think we were on a path, and I think people are hurting now. But I think if you look at the World Health Organizations, you know, if we look at the 350 million people suffering from mental illness, depression, of which you unpack that, and a couple of those characteristics relate to work, I think there's something in this. I think it's a great opportunity for us to have a conversation about what it could look like.
On the back of what Donna just said, I think it was Keynes who said that by now we would be working, or very soon we would be working 12 hours a week or thereabouts. And he saw a future where we could then spend our time writing poetry and doing nice things, adding value in different ways. So in a way, I think if robots and algorithms can automate our lives and we can all have more spare time to do things that are meaningful to us, that would be a great thing. And so that's something to encourage. I think now going back to what I do for my bread and butter and looking at statistics, I think what worries me is with the future of work is not necessarily that we will have a jobless future so that people won't have jobs. But I do think there are big risks of some of the negative impacts of the future falling primarily on some groups who are already disadvantaged. And I think that's our biggest concern going forward. We've seen inequalities rise in most OECD countries for the last few decades. They're at their highest point in that we've seen for a long, long time. In many emerging economies, they have been declining, but they're still astronomically high. And the question is to what extent that is sustainable. And when I talk about jobs and labor markets in particular, when I say there will probably be, I mean, I'm not worried about a jobless future, but I think some groups do perhaps have to worry about being able to get a job in the future. I'm thinking, for example, about low-skilled people, but I'm also thinking about some people who are disadvantaged in other ways. So I think that is a big concern, but also inequalities in job quality. So yes, maybe people can get a job, but it will be a very, very poor job in terms of pay, but also in terms of other working conditions, in terms of whether or not you have a voice at work, whether you're part of a union, whether you have any kind of social protection in case you lose your job. And we've seen this during the current crisis that many people were left stranded. And again, this falls on the same groups. And for someone who has always had a job since leaving university and has never become unemployed or anything like this, who's always had an interesting job, I think it's very difficult to imagine what it's like to lose a job or to work in a soul-destroying job and to have difficulty making ends meet. And I think that is really a big concern, and that we need to make sure that, because I think there are lots of opportunities going forward for better jobs. In fact, most of the jobs that are being created are high-skilled jobs. The question is whether we're leaving people behind and how we're making sure that we can get these people also to benefit from the opportunities that arise.
Thanks, everyone. Alicia, you asked for an image when you posed the question, and the image that came for me was damson blossom. Damson is a kind of a plum, local here, and the blossom is beginning to fall. And in Japanese culture, in Far Eastern cultures, the plum is a tree of healing, but also cherry blossom time, April, where we are, it all bespeaks impermanence and the temporary nature of anything we do, but also our lives themselves. So I'm really minded of that. I'm minded of the millions of people actually that we have lost, and that's in the air. Their loss is in the air. There's a spike in India at the moment. There have been terrible experiences in Italy and in England and in the United States and in China and so on and so forth. This is not a localized problem. And we've all been visited by the notion of impermanence in the way that 650 years ago plus in Europe, we were visited by the Black Death. The first global pandemic that actually, I think it was the second, but it swept through Europe and killed a huge number of people and brought about a complete revolution in life and work styles in the following 50 years. Within the following 50 years, there had been revolutions, there had been the overthrow of what we would now call government. There were all sorts of changes. And that bespeaks this notion of impermanence. I'm not sure where we're going. And I think that what concerns me is the air that I have in conversations I'm having in some quarters with people who think we're going to go back to normal, and that we're going to reconnect with some path that is going to take us to some predestined, successful, triumphant future. I'm not sure that's the case. I don't know. It may be deeply successful. I'm really with Donna in the belief that this might be a timely experience that we've been going through, this hiatus, this pause, this stop. But I can see the damson blossom falling, and it speaks for a whole load for me. So that's me. Thank you.
Yeah, living here in India, and I've tried to be pretty hands-on when it comes to the pandemic. So even when it started, I took a sabbatical and I was a frontline medic for many months before falling ill myself with the virus. What I saw was the discrepancy or the difference between what work means and what people are doing to fill their time, between like what my cousins were doing back in the UK who were furloughed. They had money coming in, 80% of their wages coming in, and suddenly they had all this time, and Instagram was full of people doing hobbies, etc. Also, while their bills were being paid, obviously it was lesser than what they were used to, but nonetheless, it was a more comfortable position to be in. Whereas in India, and a lot of media covered and wrote about this huge migration that happened during the first lockdown, and we're seeing that play out again this week in the second lockdown, when the daily wage earner was now doing anything she or he could do to just earn enough money to survive, right? So it's the same stimulus being applied to the system, but in one situation it leads to a very different outcome, and over here it's in a very different outcome. Therefore, I'm trying to pull a few threads together and just think through it myself, maybe not in a very coherent manner as I would like to. What is the role, therefore, of work for each of the groups of individuals that are being faced by it? And is it just around the central need to generate income to survive? Or if that's taken care of, is there something else that can be done? I think this situation we find ourselves in is creating these small experiments around the world, which we should continue to be learning from and thinking through.
Well, I think that we have people that need to work to live, to survive, to feed their family, to not starve. I just feel like that shouldn't be separate to the fact that work should be meaningful as well, or can be meaningful as well. It can be meaningful and a means to survive, I think. And so for me, I think that we've had a challenge with industrialization where we have made humans, and we look about the division of labor and Taylorism and taking people away from complete work product and changing how humans have naturally formed in terms of work and put them into what I think is an unnatural kind of circumstance generally. putting the pandemic aside, which clearly is a force in our conversations today, because it's not something that can't be ignored. But I think that the opportunity with this creative destruction is to reset. We get to create the future ourselves. It's not predetermined. We have agency to create foresight and to make new things and make things better. So I think we have an opportunity with the disruption to re-engage in conversations about how work can be a place of belonging and purpose. Humans, I mean, we have like the favor, you know, the whole idea of a species that works. It's in us. So how do we make it something that's we're driven to, but also where we feel that we can forge an individual identity, which is offered to us outside of work, and where we can come to a value exchange that is not being a conscript and being put in a box. See, that's my interest, you know, like all the work that we left after routine, cognitive stuff goes out the door and AI works its way through that. As what's left is us as humans to do uniquely human stuff, the stuff that we should, that really naturally should give us purpose, I think, and belonging at work.
Thanks, Donna. I think, Alicia, you asked what assumptions do we need to put aside? And I think that there's one assumption that we might well look at, and that is a sort of a consensus view of meritocracy in organizations. That there is some sort of natural process by which the best rise to the top and lead us towards some kind of a future. And I think that with what's been happening over the last, certainly in my lifetime, I've seen a separation of oil and water that has been happening. And the oil has been getting thicker and the water has been getting thinner and more rarefied and further and further and further away from the oil. And that's what seems to be happening at the moment. And I think that we are generationally getting to a place where meritocracy may not be possible for many people. The natural rise may not be possible for those who are uneducated, unprovided, and under-resourced to a level where they're no longer players in the game. Am I making sense? There's a sense that we are now at a place of epochal change, whatever is coming. But we are at a place of a tipping point. And beyond that, and of course, AI is important, and of course, the shifts that are going to happen, as they were 350 years ago at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But what I'm aware of is that the social changes that have come about in the period of this emergence of the communications revolution, there are people who are just not able. And that really worries me, because that's a loss of talent, firstly, but it also implies a meritocracy which isn't real anymore. And I think we need to address that. So in the past, those situations have worked into pretty unhealthy environments. So that's my point.
And actually, William, was the meritocracy ever valid?
I think I'm with you. Yes, I think I might be with you there. Yeah.
I think it was designed in a certain way
yes,
for a dominant
absolutely.
group to control
Yes.
and everyone else to get bits.
Yeah.
I think that's the case for sure.
I was actually very, very moved by what Stein, have I got the pronunciation of your name right, Stein? Stein, good, thank you. I was very moved by what Stein said, reading Steinbeck and reminding me of the grinding horror of my parents' generation. I'm just a little bit older than the rest of you. My parents' generation lived that 10 years, a decade of grinding horror. And there are people in the Far East who are less than that away from that, you know, in terms of time. And I would hate to think that we would lose all the advantages that we've gained. But there we are. That's where we are. But I was very moved by what you were saying, because your thinking seems to be informed by that reading. So anyway, there we are.
It has to be. But also, I believe what you just said about, you've said it much nicer than I could ever say about rising inequalities and this meritocracy. I think we call it sometimes kicking away the ladder or things like this, where it becomes very difficult for people to grab opportunities that are out there. I mean, just to give you one example of research that we've recently done at the OECD, where we're looking at a phenomenon called domestic outsourcing. So what is this? These are jobs that used to typically be done within the firm, and then they're being outsourced to another firm. So typical examples are things like cafeteria services, security services. And what we found is that generally when this happens, the working conditions and the salaries of these people deteriorate as a result. And we don't fully understand the mechanisms, but there's a very famous economist in the US who's called this the Fischer Workplace. So it's, you get the top and the bottom, the oil and the water, as you were saying. And one of the things that disappears is the ability of people within a firm to make kind of promotion and rise up the ladder. And then that's just one example of some of the things that we are seeing. But to go back to Alicia's question about assumption, I think there's two assumptions that I think we need to do away with. And I think one of them was already raised by Donna, but I want to reemphasize it. And that is that nothing about the future is inevitable. I think the future is something that we jointly decide on. It's between employers, between workers and government. We need to have a discussion about what kind of future we want. When you think about technologies, for example, it's not inevitable that we adopt certain technologies. This is a decision that we need to take as a society. Now, this decision-making process may not always work, but we need to try and make it work for everybody. And I think that's where social dialogue becomes extremely important. If we have a very effective social dialogue, we can decide what technologies are adopted, how they're adopted, and also what we do with people who lose from these technologies, how they're compensated. I think that's very important. So one assumption is nothing about the future is inevitable. The second assumption I think that's often made, and that I think is a fallacy, is that people seem to think there is some kind of trade-off between the number of jobs and the quality of jobs. And people always go on and say, well, you know, we can't pay so much, or we can't have these working conditions, we can't have this regulation because we're worried about affecting the number of jobs in the economy. Now, to some extent, that's true. But if you look at the countries that do best from a labor market perspective, they do best both in terms of job quantity and job quality. Whereas the countries that do worse in both job quantity and job quality. So I think these things go hand in hand. I mean, job quality enhances productivity, which then increases wages, which leads to higher demand for goods and services, which in turn leads to more employment. So I think these two assumptions, I think, are two things that we need to be careful with.
Yeah, nicely put.
And I also think the idea that the grinding horror doesn't exist for hundreds of millions of people who are in work today.
That may be true, yeah.
Maybe it's not a physical horror. Maybe it's like Death of the Salesman. Maybe it's a psychological horror of being trapped in this sort of cycle of turning up and what is fundamentally routine work, which I think has been designed so that we can be automated. I think it's there to that repeated sort of stuff that humans do. Many people do it. Is patterned for automation. But while we wait that out, I think that there are people, many people who have very we're soulful with species, you know, and we commune together, and we have the social brain, and we there's a lot of people that are quietly, I think, dying in work that we've created for them.
Yes, very much so.
Where is our spiritual self? Where is it's all the existential stuff, I know, but really, I think we've spent 150 years kind of blocking that out so that industrialization has become really the driving factor of everything we do.
Yes, there's quite a lot of work that's been done, and some. Okay, here's an ungrounded assertion, and that is that there is quite a lot of work around the notion of the right brain and the left brain, and that there is a sort of a tyranny of the left brain, a tyranny of detail and inverted commas reason and data, whereas the right brain is largely discounted. And as a poet, I've spent 25 years plus working in organizations where I have to tell you, my half of the brain is absolutely discounted. We think people think in terms of leadership through the left brain and fixing and solutions and so on and logic and all these things, but they have lost that soulful quality. And my task in organizations has always been to bring that soulful quality to the workplace. Now, perhaps that is possible because at the moment, the extent of the swing towards the left brain is almost excluding people from a meaningful working life. Joseph Campbell used to talk about, used to say, people say we're looking for a meaning. What we're actually looking for is an experience of being alive, so that at our deepest level we feel the rapture of being alive. Now, as you rightly say, we're not all in horror, Donna, but many of us don't have a path to the rapture. We don't have a path to the ecstatic moment of being alive. Work denies us that. And I think perhaps we need to build that back in to the very notion of work, that work can give us an experience that is better than we might even have hoped for.
I was thinking about that actually as William was suggesting these things. I think one of the biggest assumptions that we're not talking about is the money element, right? The role of money in work. And let's just assume there is a world in which money is distributed in a way that all of us have enough that we need to have the basic elements of life taken care of. Now, there's still going to be a hierarchy through society. Some people will be the decision makers and other people will not be. If it comes down to well-being, sorry, I lost my thread as I was thinking through that point. We look at hacking our health and wellness right now, even with the work we're doing in medicine today. Is there a way of hacking the element of providing meaning and purpose in one's work? So say everyone had enough money that they were able to survive and do well, and they were doing a job. There are going to be some jobs which quote unquote have more meaning versus other jobs that, or creating a different set of value rather than meaning, creating a different set of value in society versus other jobs which are creating other types of value. How do we hack or come up with a toolkit that we can deliver to the people who are doing a set of jobs which may be considered not as valuable with the same sense of meaning and purpose as the other jobs? I'm just thinking about a person flipping a hamburger in McDonald's. How can we give a sense of meaning into that job versus someone who is flying an aircraft full of people from location A to location B, a pilot, right? How is there a way of distilling meaning down such that it doesn't matter the work that you're doing, assuming you're getting enough money to live? Can we still create an algorithm which provides for meaning in their workspace?
I think Donna hinted towards something earlier, and I think actually you also, and Marcus, and that was that purpose might be a link. I love the Japanese notion of ikigai, which is basically a reason to get up in the morning. Yeah. Which is, there's been someone wrote a book about it in Okinawa, where people live longer than anywhere else. They live to be 100 and something. There are more centenarians per square foot. You have to push centenarians out the way to go to the supermarket. But basically, what they have a purpose. They have a sense of purpose, and that doesn't seem to be linked to status or hierarchy or anything of the kind. So theoretically, there could be a link there. I'm not quite sure. Without a common culture, we don't have those sort of linkages. So I'm not quite sure how we might get it. Any thoughts, Donna?
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking about purpose and then belonging,
Yeah.
about purpose and belonging associated with meaning. But I do think that we have a very, very, very specialist economist here who deals with the future of work. And so work is the bedrock of capitalism. And the cycle of cash, if you look at where Ford started and wanted to pay people more so they had more money to buy stuff, and you know that's where we all became consumers and workers. So I think that and these are really big questions, and obviously that's why we're here today to talk about those. But for me, purpose and belonging at work starts with the organisation, and it starts with the leaders in the organisation. And we have had 150 years of directorial leadership, which is about control, and it's about command and control. And we are moving into a time in history that I believe where the empowering leadership is going to be the mantra for bringing conditions of work in the same structures that we deal with today. It's all about behaviours. It's all about values and behaviours. And I don't think actually this idea of productivity, it makes me laugh. We always hear about productivity, but I don't think we ever knew. There's no baseline. It's not scientific. I mean, how do we know what makes humans productive, really? I don't think we've ever tried lots of different things. We kind of have one kind of way of doing that. But for me, I think human beings are capable of a lot more than we've given them credit for in the last couple of 100 years, for sure. I think we're busting to get out there and deliver true value and have a proper value exchange where we're valued for the purpose that we have, whatever that is, I think.
Okay, I'm going to dive in and just see what happens. I think that I want to get back to an assumption, another one of these assumptions, and that is that Western capitalism, as we know it, let's call it the American model, let's call it whatever we care to call it, is largely a Christian Puritan work ethic driven notion. And that means there are the damned and the saved. So we're back to the oil and water again. And what we get within this within this system is that it's sort of preset. The outcome is preset, that there will be certain people who will do very, very well, and there will be other people who do not do so well. And until we change that, I think we're in real trouble. The only way to do that is to keep a notion of community that is small enough so that everyone knows everyone and that everyone has contact with everyone. the problem that we've found, and certainly the problem I've found in working with groups online, is that that feels like contact, but is not contact. I think we're learning the limits of online work and online living, and we've had this forcefully shown. So I think that there's a need that we have to, how do we get back to these idea of the viable village community in which everybody knows everybody and everybody effectively has a say, and that there is a sense of consensus rather than top down, you will do so and so. We've talked over the last 15, 20 years of flatter organizations and so on and so forth, but we're not getting any closer to that in my experience.
I'll jump in if I may. I think, to me, one of the biggest unknowns coming out of this crisis is what will happen to teleworking and working from home. Before the crisis, people were still kind of reticent about teleworking. Some people did it. I think the rate, it was around, I think it was 3% of people who regularly teleworked. I think it was then another 10% of people who you call people who were highly mobile workers. So they were workers who could work anywhere really. And then there was another 5% of people who would occasionally telework. So it was 18%. And I think it took 2 decades to get from 9 to 18%. Wow. Then during the crisis, we went to 40% overnight. And many people have said, oh, this is what we will come back to. We will keep teleworking even after the crisis. And I don't know. I have my doubts, and I'm very curious to see. I still hear very mixed things. My hunch is that people need social contact, and this is good for innovation. It's good for job quality. It's good for productivity. Donna, your favorite word. I think there are, that's my hunch, but we'll see. I mean, we have made lots of investments in teleworking. We've investments in skills and equipment, in new ways of working. But one thing that I think is very interesting, and it comes back to some of the values that we were talking about earlier, I think to a large extent, teleworking depends on trust. And yes. I wonder if that's been possibly one of the good things to come out of this, is that maybe some employers who were reticent prior to this may have seen that actually it may not be too bad. That's my hope. But I also see other things emerging where people increasingly invest in tools to monitor workers at a distance. And that's something that worries me, because I don't think that's good for productivity. On the contrary, at least not in the long run. It's not very sustainable. So I think it's something that in a way, it's the values that come out of this experiment that we've gone through. I'm very curious to see what will come out of it at the other end. And being an economist, I look forward to seeing the statistics on this, because that's what I believe in. But that's what I'm very curious about.
I've got a hunch, and the hunch is that I think that hybrid work will stay. And I think hybrid work will stay in various forms, depending on the organisation, because what happened once the pandemic sort of settled into, okay, this is not a month, is that all those companies that actually used to broker the square meterage commercial and space for organisations found themselves at the receiving end of a pretty negative situation. And so all these contracts of millions of square feet of commercial space were not signed. And so to me, organisations, that's a big overhead. If they can get by without that overhead. And then there's all this ethical conversations about then bringing work into a person's personal space in their home and just taking over like your lounge room or wherever else without any conversation about that. I think there's going to be conversations about that. I think there's going to be legal kind of constructs around liability and so on and so forth. But I have a feeling that this in some way, shape or form will stay for 2 reasons. For the commercial reasons, I think the cost down approach, but also because I think there's a generation of people who like the option to have the choice, to be able to do two days here and 3 days there. So I think those things will clash. And I think it's going to be challenging to get back. By the way, I'm 100% with you. I think we just need to be together. Not always, but.
I had a very interesting experience during the lockdown period. That is, I ran a men's group for 50 men. And traditionally, we would gather in a space, and the first 24 hours is pretty edgy, because most men going into a group of other men would think, am I going to get beaten up? Am I, all the schoolyard experience comes up for men. That's the way it works. Am I going to be oppressed in certain parts of the world? Is anyone going to get killed, and is it me? There's all that. All that is very much a part of a man's experience when he's put in a room with 30, 40 other men. With 50 men, it gets bigger and bigger, exponentially. What was really interesting is that by doing it online, and this, I'm coming back to Stain's word, trust here, the level of trust was established very quickly, because there was no sense of immediate personal space being invaded with violence. There was no risk at that level. I found that fascinating, and we plowed on, and we were a fortnight ahead of ourselves, so that 6 or 8 weeks into the process, we were 10 weeks into the process still. But something else happened, and that was that we never really got to the truly authentic expressions of discomfort, of honest rage and anger, of shame and envy that you can get to in those places, which is what is so healing about them. So there was an immediate plus in the level of trust, but it didn't actually happen ultimately. And it did at a certain level, but not to the level that I would have been seeking. I don't know if that makes any sense. So there seem to be two things going on. Do any of you have a similar other experiences with online working, that you don't get as far, that you get an immediate plus and then something doesn't materialize?
Yeah, a lot of the work that I do is sales based, like any coach, like any leader, and
yep.
In the old days, and in India is one of those countries which is hyper relationship driven, right? Even the hyper local cities within India, in a Delhi, for example, you can only close a deal by visiting in person and shaking hands, right? They will not even close the deal over the phone, right? Now, of course, the lockdown meant that all of this was transactionally going on digitally, and that meant that efficiency went up, and everyone was a big fan of that in the beginning. But often now, if I talk to any of the sales folks, they'll say that they're missing the human contact that comes with closing out a deal. So you might be doing more sales calls and maybe doing more volume of work, but the depth of that relationship with the client and how much you ultimately sell seems to be going down. So it's interesting.
Very interesting.
That, you're heightening the trust, but you're not getting as deep as you would want it to get that break.
Absolutely, that's it. Yeah. Do
you think humans will adapt, though? We're so adaptable. Do you reckon that like give us a couple of 100 years and that we could go back to that? Do you know, like we'll reestablish and reset?
My fantasy is that we can. My fear is that we will shut down if we continue in this way. What I've noticed in working online this last year, as opposed to previous years, is that we really, really aren't taking in the hidden body language in every single person in the room. We're not taking in the tapping of the foot. We're not, I used to talk about with coaches, I used to talk about drop a pencil every now and again at a meeting, have a look at what's going on with the feet under the table. It's like really curious, all these serene people at the top with their feet battering around underneath. And also we don't notice that. We don't see what in poker they call tells. the visual the visual symbols and signals that the people are giving unconsciously, that we fold into our understanding of people. It's very important in sales. It's equally important in meetings, is that we unconsciously take in huge amounts of information. When we've only got that, we're working at face value, and that's not always good. I don't know how we can adapt to that. What do you think, Stan?
I think this is my personal opinion here that I have to share, and I think I fully agree with you, William. Fully. I mean, again, there's no OECD research on this topic, but I don't think we might be able to adapt, but it wouldn't be the same level of interaction that we've had in the past. So I would hope we don't adapt, because I fully agree with you that we're missing out on a lot of things. And in my job, I do a lot of Zoom meetings, and it is clearly not the same as having meetings in person, even if it's just about the cocktail after the conference, where you actually make the connections.
Yes.
And that's on the human, on the personal level. And I think these are the things that we miss out on in this digital world.
Yeah.
There's a guy, and I can't remember his name, because typically I can't now remember his name, but he's the guy who was an inventor with Apple who invented the swipe. And he has this amazing, and it's called the Inhumane Something of Thought. And it's an amazing YouTube presentation. And he talks about how he never designed these boxes for human beings to interact with. It was never his intention that this would become how we would live our lives, because he was saying that we're like a dog in a cage with these things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, clearly this is not ideal. It's not an ideal kind of circumstance.
On the other hand, it's really nice to have an insight in people's personal lives. I can see where you live, and that gives another dimension. But it's very limited. It's very limited, and I hope that coming out of this pandemic, you mentioned that we have this hybrid world maybe, and I think there are advantages to teleworking, and to, we can reach people all over the world very easily now. I think I've taken on some habits that I hope I will keep. It's so much easier to reach out to people now, and that's something that before the pandemic never really crossed my mind, that I could just set up a Zoom call with somebody in India or with somebody, and very easily. It seemed to be a big thing to do that, whereas now it seems to be something normal. And maybe that normalization is something good that we take away. So I hope we keep the good things and also remember the bad things, so that we come out of this better than the situation we're in before the pandemic. So hopefully we will have learned something. Also, and this is the other point I should make, and again, I don't have any data for this, and I'd love to see statistics, but I get a sense that many women prefer teleworking to what was happening before, and partly because of the flexibility it offers. Now, part of me worries about this, because I think it still shows some inequality in how caring responsibilities and the burden of unpaid work is distributed. But at the same time, I think we might have learned some lessons about flexibility, and letting people work not only where they want, but when they want. And I do hope that we take that lesson forward, so that we create a workplace that's more inclusive going forward.
I think it's reinforced the importance of that in the success of a business, how important relationships are. People have, of course, missed it for so long, having been physically distancing and not traveling as much. It's been interesting when I talk to some clients and ask them about the breadth of their relationships. Quite often what they also sometimes describe anecdotally, again, going back to folks who work in sales, is that in the old days, they may have a Rolodex of 1,000 people that they were in touch with, right? And just routinely connecting with, getting updates from, etc. What this period of time has taught them is that actually the majority of the business comes from maybe 100 to 200 of them, and they are rather focusing their energies and efforts on that group of 200 people. in the hope of generating sales and business and deepening those relationships, because they recognize that the rest of that Rolodex within that ecosystem was marginally contributing towards the gain that they would see. So I think it's, again, comes back to what William was saying about this village concept, this micro community concept, right? And we've all learned from social networks and the problems that are associated with that. And the Japanese have the moai and that group of 5 and these small hyper communities of trust. So I think this role of relationship, deepening the relationships that we have access to, figuring out which is more important for us. These are all some of the early signs that I'm seeing in business here. I think it's been very clear, the narrative shift that's happened in the last 12, 14, 15 months now, the competitive advantage of well-being. You know, for decades before this, I was banging this drum, talking about how self-care, well-being, performance, these are all intricately linked. It's not different sides of the equation. Well-being is the foundation upon which you build performance, productivity, attributes of success, etc. 2020 has shone a massive floodlight on that. Organizations which would never have even thought about reaching out to me have begun to do so. And the depth of it has increased. It started off looking at disengagement and helping my employees manage their stress and mitigating the effects of loneliness and lockdown. And now, as we are planning with many organizations, not only MNCs, but even regional players, looking at the hybrid nature, shared experiences, how do you manage the different responsibilities at home, looking at fueling peak performance. A lot of the dialogue has evolved so quickly in the last few months. Chief well-being officers being appointed with many of these organizations. The role of HR now actually building well-being frameworks into their metrics of success and KRAs and OKRs, etc. This is all fantastic. This is incredible. And I think this is a great opportunity for all of us who've been pushing this agenda to make sure that certain processes now just become ingrained within the system. That even if there was a rapid shift back to the old ways, not that it will happen, but even if that were the case, that these just become now intuitively built in. So I think these a lot of these learnings around well-being have definitely benefited people, and I think we've got a lot more that we can do over the next many years.
And I think organizations respond to the biggest signal that they're getting in terms of a disruption. And in this, it was very interesting to me because I could see the technologies of Industry 4, the fourth industrial revolution, were really the key focus on what would change work. That was the future of work conversation. We had longevity, we had global mobility and some other aging, etc. But it was fundamentally, the conversation in my circles was around what the technologies were going to do to work. And then suddenly the pandemic happened, nature happened to us. We realized that we're actually part of a natural system. We're highly vulnerable. And then the biggest conversation, the biggest themes of conversations I was having is the need for people to take care of their teams. Psychological safety, identity, people like, I'm there, my identity is in that office, in that wherever. And now I'm at home and I'm not sure how to work and I don't have the tools, and a lot of organizations weren't as close to digital transformation as they needed to be. So they really had nothing to connect to their people. And suddenly the conversation's there. So we have Future Work Skills Academy, and we have gone from a very different demand in the market, which is really almost more around creativity and innovation, to community, cultures of belonging, adaptive thinking, collaboration. It completely changed overnight. Literally in a month, it pivoted. People, organizations were asking for programs around humans connecting. How do we get a culture of belonging in a hybrid workforce? ? So many. And these are big organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees. The big, all financial services as example. So I've seen a big change. I love it. People become important now, and they always should have been. So I'm glad Marcus is saying this. I'm glad you're there, Marcus, with solutions that organizations can tap into, because you were ahead of the wave. You had frontier solutions that were right there ahead of the wave, and you're there. And of course, then we have William, who has the wisdom to be able to give people an understanding of that different side of the brain about being a human being, you know. And all the poets. We need the poets now, right now, I think.
I think people are actually, they are accessing their poetics. Let's put it like that. I think that there are cracks. If you can imagine a sort of like a vault, the great starry vault of heaven, there are cracks in it where the light is getting in and things are changing. And I think in the process, because we have been separated, because we have been isolated, alienated, and variously apart, I think that we have been accessing a poetic side to ourselves, maybe not knowing what it is, but certainly it's been there. And I've had some extraordinary interactions with people over the last 9 months, particularly, but I've had some astonishing interactions with people who have been accessing things from an entirely different point of view. They're far less transactional, they're far more relational, and they're far more willing and open to have conversations that kind of go off anywhere, but then come into something meaningful at the end. And I think that's very helpful, really. But, yeah.
I was talking to a couple of my investors yesterday, and they were asking me, you know, what's the vision for the next 10 years? Like, how are you narrating this story? And I don't know why I was reminded of this book I read many years ago, Google, and the playbook that they made with regard to all the little experiments that they did at Googleplex, and really, you know, leading the way in Silicon Valley, at least, of creating a hardware, a physical environment for people to promote well-being. And so as I was telling them about this vision, I said, well, I think the time is now right for us to tell the world that now we need to invest in the software of well-being, which is hacking the operating system of the human body. I mean, who's read the operating manual? It's you know, it didn't come out after the baby. There's no operating manual that comes out after that. Well, it's time for us to define it and figure out a way of hacking that software. And I think as companies think about the digital transformation they're making in their employees' lives and connecting them digitally through communication and Zoom and computers, can we also tell them that it's now time to invest in the other software that needs to be invested in their employees, which is around the well-being and the people? So I always like to start at the basics, and I think aspects like simple first three things are sleep, how you fuel the body, and then of course the amount of movement that we get in our everyday lives. This is the fundamental basis, and one can go very deep, and I often get CEOs and clients who I'm working with who you know, we're looking at their genomic markers and biomedical markers and track data from their wearables, etc., which is fascinating. And of course I love getting into that because I'm a geek, but ultimately at a population level, and it's the theme of the next book, which I'm writing on human longevity, I've got, it's a 5S framework. It's sleep, it's steps, it's sugar, it's social relationships, and the last S always evades me when I try and do this live. But it's but it's you know, it's 5 very simple things that we need in our life. So, you know, 8 hours of sleep, you know, making sure there's no sugar, refueling the body correctly, and getting at least 10,000 steps. And then of course we layered it up. So we look at body, we look at brain, we look at heart, we look at energy, and all the different quadrants that make us who we are as human beings. But what I'm learning is that actually none of this is rocket science. There's so much wisdom which exists in the world, and the beauty of technology now is it's providing us with the toolkit to actually analyze the suggestions that exist. And if you take something as simple, I talk about intermittent fasting. There's something that I do in my life. I'll go, you know, 24 hours, 36 hours only on a water only diet. and we're often, going 12 to 14 hours a day without any food. And in India, you've got Jainism, you've got Buddhism, you've got obviously Hinduism, and all the different, whether it's Islam or Judaism or so many different cultures around the world, religious and non, have got a period of no eating factored into their construct. Now we've got the tools available to actually measure the biochemical changes in the body and what's happening at the epigenetic level, at a mitochondrial level, and why fasting is good for you. And that's what I find most fascinating, is technology is allowing us to catch up with wisdom. And there's so much that can be done around that, therefore.
I have a bit of a personal insight. Sorry, William.
Go ahead.
So I started this Future Work Skills Academy 5 years ago, and we use the Institute for the Future's 10 skills, 2020, ironically. And it was about, these are the 10 skills that humans need for the future of work. We needed them for our clients in our other business, which continues to go ahead. And we do a lot of human capital transformation and training. So we couldn't find them. So I thought, well, why don't we have an academy? So I've got these specialists around the world, not many of them, by the way, hen's teeth, found them. Then we had to work out, well, what's the science of actually teaching these skills? Like, because there's not much about them. Many of them are uniquely human. So anyway, we put these things together, and MIT Media Labs helps us with putting the digital, because we wanted it to be digital. And so we put it up there, and we had hundreds of people, and nothing happened. So I'll fast forward to many experiments. And what the experiments found was that actually, and we just had a course finished today, same thing came back. That was, they get it, but how do they apply it to their life? We are so lost with these human skills, with social intelligence, with the idea of adaptive thinking and growth, all these things. So they get it, but then how do they apply it to their life? And that's where the coach came in, the magic of the coach. And that is somebody who could translate this to the personal pain points and context of these individual participants' lives, changed everything. And to me, when things are highly like we're in a VUCA world, the role of the coach, in my experience, has been to kind of take the complexity and narrow it down, and to support a person in applying that to their personal journey and to their personal challenges. And without that connection, no one got it. The only time they got it was when they had a coach to take them through it. Interesting. That's when they connected. It just, they just were so foreign to them. They knew, because the education hasn't included any of this unless you're in the Nordic countries, of course.
Yeah.
Very interesting to me.
Thanks, Laura. You were asking about tools and for coaches, and the one tool I think that is essential, and I'm in a sense coming back to Donna's point, but that is that we have the ability to open up the imaginal realm for people, and that it's. I use the word soul when I talk to people. Now, you could use the word psyche if you want, but the fact is the soul or the psyche doesn't do data. It doesn't, it's like a chicken, it can't count. 1, 2, too many. That's the soul. It deals in images, it deals in pictures. A wedding ring is a picture the soul can understand. So we need to encourage imagery. We need to encourage pictures. We need to encourage people to think imaginally. Now, the difficulty is that the workplace is increasingly, or has been increasingly, predicated upon the data, all of which is valid, all of which is absolutely right and useful. However, as coaches, we need to open up the imaginal so that they can open up to these things that Donna was talking about. And I think that that's a tool, and that would be do a ritual, read a poem, go out and pick some flowers from the garden, use all those things just so that you can you can open up a different area. And I think that makes a big difference. Also, the flowers smell nice, but that's another matter.
I'm afraid I'm going to ruin the poetry now by coming in as
Go
an
for it.
economist.
It's all poetry.
And perhaps taking a more macro point or stand back a little bit. I mean, I don't know anything. I don't really know what works at the personal level from a coaching perspective, but we do know quite a bit about what happens for labor markets as a whole. So at the OECD, we assess labor market performance along a number of dimensions. One is, of course, the number of jobs. I think that's important. Two is the quality of those jobs. The third aspect is inclusiveness, making sure that everybody has good jobs. I think that's another important point. Aspect is resilience and adaptability. So when we have a crisis, how well do we live that crisis and get out of it? And how few or many jobs do we lose during that crisis? How much pain is there during this crisis? And so I think over the years, we've learned quite a bit about how we build good labor markets. I mean, we don't have, of course, all the answers, but we do have a good idea of what makes successful labor market performance along the dimensions that I've just cited. And when you think about it, it's first of all, it's about having regulation in place that adequately protects workers. I think that's important. While at the same time giving firms some flexibility, of course, because they need to adapt to changing circumstances. I think we mustn't forget that in the end they create jobs, and that's important as well. So we don't want something that's stifling. Worker protection is also social protection. So when people lose a job, we want to make sure that they have sufficient resources so that they can find a new job. That bridge to finding a new job is important. If you don't provide people with that bridge, yes, they might find another job, but it's not necessarily a job that meets their skills or their experience. You want them to be able to find a job that's as good as possible. It's also about investing in training and skills. We know that labor markets are changing constantly. We know that the skills that are being demanded are constantly changing. And we need to be able to give people the opportunities to reskill, to upskill, so that, again, they can grab these opportunities. And I think another really important ingredient is the social dialogue. I've already referred to this, but making sure that all workers, not just workers, also people outside the labor force, people who are unemployed, people who are discouraged, people who are inactive, that they have a voice, and that there is an equal bargaining power between employers and workers on the other hand, so that, again, we can make decisions together about, what do we invest in, and how are the gains and productivity distributed amongst people. So these are in very broad lines, I think, some ingredients that make a labor market function well. And I think that's as important as some of the more individual things that we've been talking about so far. We need to be working in a system. So I'm not saying that they're more important. I'm just saying that they're also important as the things that, and this is why I've really enjoyed the conversation today, is that we've heard different perspectives, and it's important to take all of these into account when making policy, when deciding about what makes work valuable and what the future of work looks like.
So, and I think one of the interesting things about labour market, the idea of the labour market, is the idea that once you're out of it, you're a social problem.
Yeah.
So you're spat out, but then you become not the problem of the labour market itself. And therein lies a significant issue that we have this conversation about universal basic income and so on and so forth, but there is no kind of responsibility on the labour market to keep people in it, if you know what I mean. It's like a very meta kind of issue, right?
I think it was William, as a poet, who said that it's wasting human resource. And that's a very economist thing to say. The people who are out of the labor force, you're losing valuable resources. I mean, you're talking as an economist and talking about resources when you talk about people, but it's the skills, it's what they have to contribute. And it's like you say, it's not a problem versus, it's another problem that they're out of the workforce in the sense that I mean, it's a problem for society that they're out of the workforce, because you want them in, and you want to do everything to make sure that people are in the workforce, because
Yes.
it's not just about people themselves, it's about the meaning that they have of contributing. And it's about looking after one another. And I think this is how, again, I think labor markets are most successful, is by being as inclusive as possible and by reducing the barriers to let people participate and make sure that their skills, their talents are used.
We have 2 young kids at home. My son just turned 5 and my daughter is 2.5. My wife and I, we often have this conversation. We're both medics, and something that we think about is, do we want to encourage our children to get into medicine, or should we, encourage them to do something else? And we have this chat actually as parents, and I'm sure many parents have this chat around what is the future of their work going to be? What do we even advise them in terms of subjects to pick at school, and what should they be learning? How should they be learning, etc. And what I'm most excited about is actually, and she hates this because she's petrified of the idea of it, whereas I just am enthralled by it, in suggesting to my kids that they don't plan for working on Earth. They should be planning a career which will exist on hopefully the moon, and I'd be very happy to be there with them, and maybe Mars in their lifetimes for sure, maybe not mine, in terms of proper living and working. So that's this healthy tension that we have in our house, of not limiting the sphere to just consider what we know today, but it could be anything. And for me and us, it's about even choosing a different planet to where we even live right now. My son loves building things. He loves like carpentry and plumbing, etc. So for him, it's about being a plumber or being an electrician. That's his latest craze. My daughter is still very, very young, but I see the steady hand that she has, and I think she'll make a fine surgeon maybe one day. So she can do some robotic surgery on Mars, something that I may not be able to do.
Imaginally, if I were to throw myself forward 20, 30 years or whatever that might be, I think we will have been through some kind of a fire. And that will be to do with climate change and our inability to summon up the will to do much about it in time. We are in for something spectacular that's going to happen to us all. Is already happening to many of us. And I think that we will have achieved a level of humility as a people, as a species, that might be really good for us. And in the wake of all that, I think that we might be beginning to find a way to put the teaching of all these important things that we've talked about this morning, which actually don't appear yet in the workplace. It's not carved in stone above the reception when you walk into any organization. The notions of working with the body, the notions of working in community, the notions of all these things, I think that we might have a different attitude, because we are going to end up teaching our children to be very different human beings. That's what I think. So in that sense, I have hope. Not particularly optimistic, but I do have hope. And that could be, it could be very beautiful, actually.
I'd like to avoid the destruction. Hopefully we are clever enough to avoid it. I'm a techno optimist, or a science optimist. In a way, what we've seen in the pandemic and how with science we've been able to deal with it makes me an optimist. I read an article saying, what if the pandemic had happened 10 years ago? I think we would not have been as resilient as we are now. It's quite scary to think about it. 10 years ago, would we have been able to develop vaccines so quickly? Nobody would have been able to telework in the same way as we did now. So I think there's a lot of optimism from my perspective on what we will be able to achieve. And in the ideal world, I mean, this is a long-term trend that we are actually spending less time on work than we did 50 years ago. And I think that's a very positive trend. Even 100 years ago, people spent even more time on work. So that's a positive trend. And I hope that trend continues through technology, that we can, in a way, move towards this Keynesian utopia of less and less work, but also that basically we all have our own robot to do our own work, so that that reduction in working time is equally distributed. Now we can all benefit from technology and the progress that we may make. So I think that that's my utopia, and where I hope we will be in the next 10, 20 years. I doubt it, but it's a dream.
I mean, so many great things, but souls don't deal with data. I mean, how fantastic is that? And to me, what do I hope? I hope that we look back. You see, the thing is with hybrid work is that kind of directive leadership models don't work. Why? Because people ghost you. It's like you can't get them. It's amazing. This thing about this virtual situation is you can be ghosted. You got a whole workforce ghosting you. And so we have to because it's dysfunctional, doesn't work, directive leadership. So empowering leadership has got to be the way that we move forward, I think, because our organisations won't function without it. So to me, I hope we look back and say, okay, all literally leadership models that were formed in the 50s, the ones that we still use today, they're the same names in the organisational design, etc., that we use. I think all that legacy stuff gets kicked to the curb, and we start looking at that which fosters social cohesion in people, and that is community. We look as community as the future of work. We have the trust to redesign how humans commune based on what attracts us, so that that which compels us to come together, to be the species that we have, to advance how we have. We go back to that which we know works, that which is human, and forget about that blind spot in history that we did some other experiment. That's what I hope.
Well, it was really great to hear that economists are magicians too, and that I had an economist friend who used to say, "Oh, well, it's all fantasy anyway. It's all a construction," which I think is very interesting. But it's really great to imagine that we can have these kind of conversations, and that they might be live in the workplace as well, and that they are going on all over the place. That I feel very hopeful about that. And I've had a really good interaction with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed your company. So that's me. I'm done.
Yeah. Thanks, Lance. Donna?
I'm with William. I just think we need to have more of these conversations. I think we need to hear more voices. I think that somehow, I don't know how this has happened, because with communications like exponential and there's a tsunami of data and voices, etc., in the world, I just feel like we haven't heard everyone. I think Marcus has made a number of points today about a very different reality for where he is, and that we have to broaden our scope to think of the whole of humanity here, and that we have to welcome conversations, even if they're hard ones. And we have to respect the kind of transdisciplinary need that we have if we're going to foster and cultivate, meaningful lives for everybody, at work and otherwise. So yeah, more talking, more conversations like this, for sure, I think are important.
Stan?
I think this is at least the third time that Donna has taken the words out of my mouth. I fully agree with what she's, I was going to say the same thing. I think the diversity of voices and the diversity of expertise, I think, is really, really valuable. And that's why I was attracted and interested in this conversation today. And it's been very useful, because you're reminded of things that deep down inside but because it's not your area of expertise, you don't necessarily talk about as much. And being forced to listen to other people who have different expertise is really, really helpful. And it's a nice kind of reminder that that's how we need to function in a more holistic approach to things.
Yeah, I absolutely love this platform. I think the way you've even suggesting the weaving of wisdom, it's a fascinating visual to leave us with, and one can imagine the construct that you build through this over the many years with all the different voices coming together. For me, the one sort of reflection and thing that I've written down, which I'm going to really focus on this week, is how can we biohack for purpose? I talk so much about biohacking in the work that I do, but it's all around the physical lens, the mental lens, and the emotional lens. And I'm wondering if the secret sauce, the elixir of life, may just exist within purpose and meaning, then is there a way of biohacking for that and help spreading it for people to imbibe within their day-to-day work, irrespective of what they do to earn their money?